Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker, and in today's video we're going to be talking about some NBA teams that for one reason or another could potentially be making some big trades this upcoming season. Now, some of these teams we kind of already knew about as potential trade partners before the year, and other ones have emerged now with just how their season has gone through the first week or so. And we're going to begin with what is, in my opinion, probably one of the biggest surprises of the early season so far, and that is the Sacramento Kings. And the big surprise is how truly awful they've been. They haven't won a game yet. They've looked awful under new head coach Luke Walton, and there's the possibility that this team might just want to start selling off parts to build for the future. Now, things aren't going to get as extreme as trading Buddy Hield and De'Aaron Fox and Marvin Bagley and guys like that, but they do have other pieces on their roster that could be valuable to other teams, and they could get some pieces back for them that might make a little bit more sense for them on a longer term timeline, just based off how this season has gone. The first piece that comes to mind here is upcoming free agent Bogdanovic, who's actually going to be the subject of the trade machine video for tomorrow. So if you have any trade machine ideas for Bogdanovic, I already asked over on Twitter, but you can leave those down in the comment section below here as well. And he's a player that, like I've talked about in the past, could really fit in a couple of different places and could be a really interesting piece on the trade market. Now, obviously the fact that he is a free agent this offseason does bring down his value a little bit, because he's probably going to demand a pretty significant contract, and the team trading for him will likely bring that up in negotiations, but still, he should be someone that should at least get the Kings back something. Because as I talked about in a video right when the season started, it's going to be tough to pay all of the players that the Kings have to pay over the next couple of seasons, whether it be Fox, Bagley, and then also Bogdanovic as well. So it might make sense not only from an on-court standpoint to mix things up to trade this guy away to get future pieces, but also from a long-term financial salary standpoint as well. And then beyond that, some of the other players they could potentially look to move are some of the guys that they signed this offseason. That wouldn't be able to happen until December because they just signed new contracts, so you have to wait until then to trade them away. But potentially Dwayne Dedmon, Trevor, Ariza, and Corey Joseph, or maybe even Harrison Barnes could be on the move to the right team. Now, having said that, I don't think it's necessarily likely that those veterans are the guys that end up being traded, or even someone like Ariza. I would still bank on it being Bogdanovic just based off how this season has gone. I don't think the Kings are going to want to pay him any offseason, so they might as well get some value out of him. So he is definitely a player, and the Kings are a team to keep an eye on for a potential big trade, or what would be a big trade, at least in my opinion. Moving on now, let's talk about another surprising team so far this season, and that is the Minnesota Timberwolves. And the big upgrade spot for them potentially could be at the point guard spot. Most recently on the Woj pod, Woj was talking about how the Timberwolves are looking to make the playoffs this season and are looking to upgrade at the point guard position over Jeff Teague, and they certainly have the movable contracts and the motivation to potentially make that move. They've gotten off to a really great start. Karl Anthony Towns has looked awesome so far, and you could maybe start to convince yourself that this is a team that could push for a playoff spot. After all, when Jimmy Butler was still there, they were a playoff team, and going into last season, if he had stayed, they probably would have pushed for a playoff spot then as well. So now that they have guys like Robert Covington and Jarrett Culver, if they upgrade that point guard spot and Cat keeps playing like this, it's definitely a possibility that they could end up making the playoffs. Now, in terms of who they would go out and get, it's kind of up in the air. Either of the Oklahoma City point guards, whether it be Dennis Schroeder or Chris Paul, are going to be targets, and people are going to talk about those guys, but I'm not convinced that those are great fits for this Minnesota Timberwolves team. Even though Paul would help them in an immediate sense, that contract long term just does not look great at all. And even a straight up swap for Teague with Paul would be kind of iffy for me, even though the money doesn't necessarily work. The Wolves would have to add in a little bit more salary, but if that's all they're giving up, even then I'm not convinced that it would be a great idea to bring in someone like Chris Paul, because say what you want about him as a player, but he is relatively volatile at times in a new situation. And so other than that, we'll just kind of have to wait and see what other point guards become available. But like I said, with the Jeff Teague expiring, with how well Karl Anthony Towns is playing, with how well this team is playing, and the potential to push for a playoff spot, this is a team to keep an eye on in the trade. Moving on now to another team that could potentially be selling off pieces of their team to look towards the future, and that's the Oklahoma City Thunder. And we always kind of thought that this was going to be the case for this team coming into this season. They were going to be solid, but they weren't going to be a playoff team. They've got all of these pieces on their roster that they could potentially look to move, and I still think that that's the case. Any four of Danilo Gallinari or Steven Adams or Dennis Schroeder or Chris Paul, the two guys that I just talked about with the Timberwolves, any of those guys could potentially be available, and I would expect at least two of them to be traded, because the issue with this Thunder team is they want to build towards the future, but they're not going to be awful. They're not going to be as bad as maybe they want to be if they're truly looking to tank this season, because they do have solid players like those guys that I just listed, in addition to players like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. So trading away two of those players would not only get them assets, but would also make them a little bit worse and help their draft position this year, because again, it doesn't really seem like they're going to be making the playoffs anyway. And in my opinion, among those four guys, the most likely to be traded would be Danilo Gallinari, simply because he is an expiring contract and the team should look to get some kind of value out of him, as he was a relatively big piece in that Paul George trade. And just like Bogdanovic, he's a player that would fit in a variety of circumstances. Like, I think even teams like Toronto that are maybe surprising even themselves in terms of how well they're playing to start this season, that would be a good Gallinari destination. I'm not sure they could make the salaries work there, but he is definitely a guy to keep an eye on. And even if they're just able to get out from under the salaries of Steven Adams and Dennis Schroeder and Chris Paul, that would be a huge deal for them, because it just provides them so much more flexibility moving forward with this roster, with all these draft picks and with SGA. And I do think there would be a market for all of those players, even given some of their inflated salaries. I just talked about CP3 and Schroeder potentially being a fit in Minnesota, and there are a couple of teams around the league that certainly could use a big man like Steven Adams. So the Thunder are definitely a team, like I said, we kind of knew this coming into the season, but they're definitely a team to keep an eye on as a potential trade team. Speaking of a team that could potentially be interested in Steven Adams, the Boston Celtics are the next team on this list. And the reason they're here is basically because they need a big. Like, they have a couple of options. They have Robert Williams, they have Enes Kanter, they have Daniel Tice. But this is a team that I think can actually be pretty good this year, and if they upgrade at the 5 spot, could be a true threat to represent the Eastern Conference in the NBA Finals, depending on how everything else goes with their season. I really like the top 3 guys that they have with Kemba and Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. They have other good pieces on the roster as well that complement those guys pretty well, but the issue is at the 5 spot for when they run into players like Joel Embiid or just their ball screen coverage. All those things are going to continue to be issues for this team until they upgrade at the 5. In terms of players to potentially keep an eye on, the 2 ones that continue to come up in my mind are Steven Adams, who I just talked about with the Oklahoma City Thunder, or potentially Clint Capella, but the problem there is that there's no reason really for the Rockets to trade him away unless it's for a wing that can help them on the perimeter, and then they just kind of figure it out at the 5 spot, or if things just go completely awfully with this Westbrook Harden thing, and then they potentially want to sell on Clint Capella. But those are 2 names to keep an eye on potentially for the Boston Celtics at the 5 spot. But the problem is they don't really have a ton of contracts to make any kind of money work. They have Marcus Smart, who they'd probably have to move in pretty much any deal, but even then, for a player with the salary of Clint Capella or Steven Adams, they'd likely have to attach other contracts as well, which would mean giving up on 1 or 2 of their young players, and then maybe even a pick as well. I'm not saying just specifically with a Steven Adams trade, but a trade in general, they do have to add more pieces. They can't just do a 1-to-1 swap with Marcus Smart, just because they don't have a ton of movable contracts on their roster. But this is a team that under Danny Ainge has never been afraid to make moves and make trades. And again, I think this could be a really competitive team in the Eastern Conference, even without an upgrade at the 5. But if they do get a better player at the 5 spot, that could be huge for them. And then they could suddenly be one of the most interesting teams in the Eastern Conference. And then the East could just as a whole start to look better as well with those top 4 and 5 teams. So definitely keep an eye, as always, on the Boston Celtics as a potential trade team. And then last up in terms of a potential trade team is going to be the Miami Heat. And the reason that they're here is because they've gotten off to such an impressive start. Even though Jimmy Butler didn't play in their first 3 games, they're 3-1 right now. And this is a team that could potentially push for even as high as the 3 seed in the Eastern Conference this season. They've long had a great organizational structure. Erik Spoelstra is a really good coach, and they have players stepping up for them left and right, whether it's Justice Winslow or Kendrick Nunn or Goran Dragic or Tyler Hero. They have so many good players on the perimeter that they could potentially either look to sell high on those players and trade them away, or just continue to add to the star power alongside Jimmy Butler to push towards being one of the contending teams in the Eastern Conference. Now, at the moment, it seems like Goran Dragic would be their most movable asset because he is an expiring contract, but he's actually playing really well for them in a 6th man kind of role, and I'm not sure that they would want to trade him away. But even with that, like I said, that would be in theory the most movable guy for them. They do have some other bigger contracts on their roster if they really needed to make the salaries work, potentially in a Chris Paul deal, for example. but I know that they would be really hesitant to trade away any of their younger players on their roster. So it's going to be kind of an interesting mix for them and a juggling act for them of trying to make sure that they're actually upgrading their team while also not giving up many, if any, of their younger players that they really like Tyler Hero, Bam Adebayo, unless it's for a really, truly great player. And you never know, like these kinds of things happen in the NBA all the time where we don't even know that a guy is unhappy and then all of a sudden he asks for a trade and there's a big star available and the Heat are in position to potentially make a move. The problem is they don't have a ton of future draft picks because they've already traded some of them away, so that could be an issue, but they do have assets. They have the expired contract of Goran Dragic, and if they continue to play this well, they could definitely look to make a move and be one of those top 3 or 4 teams in the East. And if that happens and the Celtics and the Heat start making moves, the Eastern Conference starts to look a lot better outside of just Milwaukee and the Sixers. So there's a lot of teams to keep an eye on potentially this upcoming season. As we talked about in the beginning of the year, before the season and the offseason, this is going to be a wide open year in terms of the championship chase. There's going to be a lot of moving parts, a lot of teams looking to make moves, and things could get really crazy at some point during the season. But like I said in the beginning, tomorrow will be a trade machine video. So if you'd like to leave a comment down below in terms of a player you want to see trades on, or if you have trades specifically for Bogdanovic, that's going to be the community player this week, then be sure to leave those down in the comment section below. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.